A reading from the Gospel of Luke, the 23rd chapter, verses 33 to 49. When they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified Jesus there with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. Then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they cast lots to divide his clothing. And the people stood by watching. But the leaders scoffed at him, saying, "He saved others. Let him save himself if he is the Messiah of God, his chosen one." The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine and saying, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." There was also an inscription over him, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals who were hanged there kept deriding him and saying, "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come in your kingdom." Jesus replied, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m, while the sun's light failed, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Then Jesus, crying out with a loud voice, said, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." Having said this, he breathed his last. When the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God and said, "Certainly this man was innocent." And when all the crowds who had gathered there for this spectacle saw what had taken place, they returned home, beating their breasts. But all his acquaintances, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance, watching these things. Have you ever counted your scars? You probably don't have to look very far to find at least a few scars somewhere on your body. We all have them. The average person has 5. I have one scar on each of my elbows from years of playing baseball and diving headfirst into far too many bases. I have another over my right eye where I took a sharp elbow in a pickup basketball game in my early 20s. And I have a few more from childhood falls and trivial accidents and minor surgeries. What about you? Can you count your scars? Our physical scars are proof that we've lived long enough to know something of what it means to experience suffering. Scars are reminders that no one gets through this mortal life unscathed. Often by no choice or fault of our own, we get wounded by life, by those we love, by a world that can feel so callous and cruel. And when it happens, it's incredibly inconvenient and uncomfortable, and often even unbearable. But it is unavoidable. And yet over time, we somehow heal, and our wounds turn into scars, and our scars serve as visible reminders that we are stronger and more resilient than we might have ever imagined. Because suffering is unavoidable, I think we should all count our scars from time to time. And perhaps if we did, we would find the courage to face a different kind of suffering in life that is entirely avoidable. A kind of suffering that many people will do anything to avoid because it seems so unnecessary and inconvenient. I'm talking about the kind of suffering a person might actually choose to endure, or at least be willing to endure, for the sake of something or someone or some cause that truly matters to them. Have you ever experienced this kind of suffering? Have you ever suffered for something? All of us will inevitably suffer from something in life: heartbreak, illness, setbacks, grief, tragedy, disappointment. It is unavoidable. But sometimes it happens that people will voluntarily choose to suffer for something in life because they believe that in the end their suffering will produce some greater good beyond themselves. Central to Martin Luther King Jr.'s commitment to nonviolence is this belief that suffering can be redemptive. King believed in the power of enduring suffering without retaliation, this willingness to accept blows without striking back. He taught that unearned suffering, for a cause, that is, can be redeeming and liberating, transformative in our relationships and encounters where violence seems to dominate. As we unpack what this might mean, let's first be sure that we understand what it does not mean. When we say that suffering can be redemptive, we are not implying that one should tolerate an abusive relationship or quietly endure the cruelty of teen bullying or passively submit to evil policies under some authoritarian dictator or refuse to defend ourselves while being violently assaulted. These are examples of involuntary suffering that only lead to victimization and the denial of one's agency or power. And there's nothing redemptive about enduring involuntary, disempowered suffering at the hands of others. What King was talking about was a willingness, a choice, to put oneself on the line for a cause or a person or a group of people without resorting to violence, even when some form of violence might be used against us. And he believed that at the heart of the nonviolent way of life is this fierce, crazy belief that there may be times when voluntary suffering can be the necessary key that liberates us and even our enemy from whatever injustices or evils imprison us. It sounds counterintuitive, even irrational, to imagine that our suffering can lead to something good. We humans have been conditioned over millions of years to think only in terms of a fight or flight response to danger or violence. In fact, we survived as a species precisely by avoiding suffering, either by running away from it altogether or by preemptively inflicting it on others before it's inflicted on us. But if it helps, take a moment to strip this concept of redemptive suffering from the conversation about nonviolence and then ask yourself, have I ever witnessed or experienced something good or life-giving coming from the voluntary suffering of another human being? If you're having trouble coming up with anything, just take a moment and look down at your belly button. Each of us is the wondrous outcome of a generous, life-giving, voluntary sacrifice that required months of discomfort and pain and some interludes of misery and anxiety and hours of very real suffering and anguish and struggle and tears. Childbirth, the sacrifice of motherhood, it's living proof that something good and beautiful can come from voluntary human suffering. And throughout history, there have been brave souls who've believed this, ordinary people who, in the face of violence and injustice, dared to imagine how much more beautiful the world might be if they themselves were willing to voluntarily suffer the birth pangs of justice and peace and freedom, to see it. What would the world look like today had Rosa Parks not refused to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, or had Nelson Mandela not endured 27 years in a South African prison to stand against apartheid, or had Gandhi not led millions to fast and pray for India's independence from the British government, or had that unidentified protester known as Tank Man not stood before a column of Chinese tanks in Tiananmen Square in Beijing, or had John Lewis not led 600 marchers across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, knowing what awaited them on the other side. Each of them faced real injustice and violence, but each refused to fight back with violence instead. Instead, they chose to respond in ways that made their own suffering inevitable and perhaps even necessary, believing that their suffering might, in the end, transform and redeem their adversaries. In Luke's Gospel, the story of Jesus' crucifixion on a cross captures the power of redemptive suffering so beautifully and convincingly. In this story, Jesus is caught between the collusions of religion and the cruelties of empire. The leaders of the temple have deemed him a religious heretic, and the rulers of Rome have judged him a political insurrectionist. And Jesus is sentenced to crucifixion on a cross, the most violent means of public execution possible and the most agonizing form of suffering imaginable. And Luke calls the crucifixion of Jesus, quote, a spectacle. It's something, in other words, you can't believe you're actually seeing. A frenzy, a mob scene. It's a first century public lynching. Hundreds of bloodthirsty people possessed by some violent spirit that is fueled by this cacophony of shouts and insults and jeering and taunting and screams and cries, and the clamor of hammered spikes, piercing human skin and separating human bones and penetrating wood. And the reverberating echo of this common refrain repeated through the scene over and again 3 different times. If you are the Messiah, save yourself. The people in the crowd are the first to shout it. Then it's the soldiers. Then even one of the criminals crucified next to Jesus. If you are the Messiah, Jesus, save yourself. It's a dare as much as an insult, because Messiahs aren't supposed to die on crosses. Messiahs are supposed to rule with power. Messiahs aren't to be ridiculed or humiliated or mocked. Messiahs are invincible, all-powerful, and merciless against their enemies. If there was ever a good time to prove to the world that Jesus really is the Messiah, this would be it right here, with everyone watching, with everything on the line. If you are the Messiah, command your army to take you from this cross and save yourself. But instead, this Messiah just hangs there. He will not command an army. He will not fight back. He will not come down from his cross. He will not even respond to his accusers. And yet he holds all the power. It's not the power to fight back. It's the power to love. He prays over his executioners while he hangs there. Father, forgive them, he says, for they know not what they do. It's the power of love, and it's not what anyone expects. He turns to one of the criminals on the cross next to him and he says, today you will be with me in paradise. It's the power of love, and it is not what anyone expects. Jesus just hangs there, and yet he holds all the power. Jesus here is nobody's victim. No one expects that he would choose his suffering. that it could possibly be the only way to defeat the evil and violence of the world, he just hangs there on the cross. And in the clamor and clatter below, what that mob of people does not seem to understand yet is that this Messiah has taken everything they could throw at him, and he has absorbed it into his own body. Every last act of evil and violence, every insult and injustice, every expression of hatred and hypocrisy and ugliness and cruelty, he has taken it all into himself. The whole violent, destructive arsenal of humanity. And he now holds it within himself as he hangs there on that cross. And now, having nothing left to throw at him, all they can do is watch him suffer. But they didn't expect that he would endure his suffering with a kind of grace that would completely disarm them. That despite everything they threw at him, despite all the violence he took into himself, what would come out of him would be pure love. Disarmed by their weapons and laid bare by this love, they can finally see the truth of what they have done and what they have become. And when Jesus breathes his last breath, the crowd falls silent and the light grows dim. Flags and spears and swords litter the ground as his lifeless body hangs from a cross. And Luke says that's when a lone centurion comes to his senses and mutters, "Certainly this man was innocent." And then the crowd of people goes home, and the people beat their breasts out of guilt and shame. What have we done? For Martin Luther King Jr., this one story of Jesus' suffering on the cross was the linchpin to his whole nonviolent movement. King learned the methodology of nonviolence from Gandhi, but this belief that suffering could be redemptive, this he got from Jesus on the cross. And he believed that it could transform not only the one who suffers, but the one who causes the suffering. And that is why he could say to his oppressors, "We will meet your physical force with soul force. Do to us what you will, and we'll still love you. Bomb our homes, threaten our children, send your hooded perpetrators into our communities, drag us out on some wayside road, beating us and leaving us half dead, and we will still love you." But he says we will soon wear you down by our capacity to suffer. And in winning our freedom, we will so appeal to your heart and conscience that we will win you in the process. Most of us will never be a Dr. King or a Rosa Parks, a Nelson Mandela or a John Lewis. We will likely never have to stand and protest before a column of tanks or march across a bridge with dogs and fire hoses awaiting us on the other side. It may be impossible from where we stand now to imagine ever having to endure real physical suffering for a cause or a person or a group of people. And besides, we figure maybe we have mortgages to pay and kids to feed and ladders to climb and vacations to plan, but still. What if we embrace this belief that suffering can be redemptive? Our world is no less violent. It's just that today's violence is just better disguised. Our modern way of life, our words, our attitudes, our politics, our ideologies, even so many expressions of Christianity today, are saturated in violent overtures and undertones. And what Jesus shows us on the cross is that sometimes the only way to conquer violence is to absorb it. And when we take it into ourselves, we can disarm it. And we can neutralize its power. We can serve as a kind of filter for its pollution, so that what comes out of us is something pure like love. What if we remembered this the next time we're in an argument or disagreement with someone, or the next time we are offended by someone, or the next time someone actually gets up on our grill or on our bumper or into our inbox, and the ugly and the crazy comes out, and we must make a choice in the moment about what to do next? Will we return it in equal and greater measure, or will we absorb it, neutralize it, filter it, so that what comes out of us is something pure like love? And what if that moment comes upon us when we feel compelled to stand for something, or stand with someone, or speak up for something, or say something for a cause or a need or a struggle that really matters to us? And in that moment we struggle with fear, or some outside voice threatens us. And what if we simply take that in and we befriend it? And then we politely put a straitjacket on it and we give it over to God. And then we get on doing what we know we must do, even if it means suffering is inevitable. This kind of suffering for something makes transformation possible, not just in the world, but in us. The Apostle Paul, in his letter to the Romans, wrote about that kind of suffering, the suffering the early Christians were going through in their time as they clung to their faith in a hostile pagan world. And so he says, our suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not put us to shame. Paul believed this too. Suffering can be redemptive, liberating. It's how we live faithfully and with honor. The South African author Alan Paton has a beautiful scene in one of his novels about a conversation between two characters, Robert Mansfield, a white South African, and Emmanuel Nene, a leader within the black community. Mansfield had been the headmaster of a white school, and he would take his school's athletic teams to play against the black schools, but then the Department of Education prohibited him from doing so. And so Mansfield resigned in protest. And that's when Emmanuel Nene, this leader in the black community, comes to meet with Mansfield, and Nene says to Mansfield, I've come to see a man who resigns his job because he doesn't wish to obey an order that will prevent children from playing with one another. And Mansfield replies, I resign because I think it's time to go out and fight everything that separates people from one another. And he asks, do I look like a knight in shining armor? Nene says, yes, you look like a knight in shining armor, but you are going to get wounded. Do you know that? And Mansfield replies, I expect that may happen. Well, says Nene, you expect correctly. People don't like what you are doing, but I am thinking of joining you in the battle. And Mansfield asks, you're going to wear the shining armor too? Yes, says Nene, and I'm going to get wounded too. Not only by the government, he says, but also by my own people. Aren't you worried about the wounds? Mansfield asks. And Nene says this, I don't worry about the wounds. When I get up there, which is my intention, the big judge will say to me, where are your wounds? And if I say I haven't any, he will say, was there nothing to fight for? And I couldn't face that question. And so we count our scars and we count our wounds, not just the ones that seem unavoidable in life, but the ones we sign up for too. Our takeaways for today: voluntary suffering can be redemptive. And sometimes the only way to conquer violence is to absorb it. Suffering for something makes transformation possible, not only in others, but in us.